Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of the Down South Hunting Podcast. This is your host, Mike Higman, and thank you for patiently waiting for part number 2 of my interview with David Toms and John Eberhard, a couple hunting legends. Combined, they've got over 100 years of hunting experience, probably, 75 years of saddle hunting. So we cover rut hunting tactics, we cover mobile hunting, scouting during the season, calling and rattling. That probably covers most of it. If you want to skip to that really good stuff, then you could probably skip ahead the next 10 minutes. I'm going to kind of give an update on my season. Also, we kind of backtrack just a little bit, couple minutes, because we got cut off during the interview. So I wanted it to have some context. And since it's been a couple weeks since I released the other episode, that'll help out a little bit. And if you remember, we got power outage, got cut out during the middle of the episode. So this is kind of the last 30 minutes we talked. Actually, the last 30 minutes we talked recording. I was able to get back on my phone with these guys on the Skype call, and they talked another 30 minutes. I wish I could have that, but they both agreed to come back and do another episode. So I'm pretty pumped about that. My season lately has been pretty boring. I guess the biggest thing to update you on is the last episode I talked about the upcoming sandbar hunt and how I was excited about doing that. And it turns out I missed it. Idiot. Normally it's the first week after Thanksgiving. And this year Thanksgiving was late. I don't know why it was scheduled different, but turns out it was the week before Thanksgiving. So I was literally getting my stuff together to get packed and wanted to check a couple things. Schedule-wise, it was going to be really tough to make it. Just family-wise, it was going to be hard on the family being out of town, and I was really debating if I could try to make it anyway. Turns out it didn't matter because I was checking for some updates online, trying to decide if I was going to make it, and I realized somebody had posted on Facebook like, hey, did anybody get anything last weekend? And I had typed in, no, the hunt's this week, and you just had one of those moments like, I shouldn't hit enter, I should check. And it turns out the hunt had been already gone by, so... the one hunt I was most looking forward to this year, I missed. So that kind of sums up my season a lot. I actually was hunting that same weekend, though. I had some family in town and was hunting up at my family property near the National Forest. Hunted several times. The coolest thing about that is my oldest daughter. She sat every hunt with me, and she was like getting up early. We were doing mobile sits. So what I had done is I was using my saddle, but I brought along my Lone Wolf Alpha. So I'd set up my sticks and all that kind of stuff, set up the hang-on stand, and then I'd set my Predator platform and the saddle up behind it. So I get to sit right behind her, which is pretty cool. And she was like extremely patient for a 12-year-old. So we sat some long sits. The most action we saw, I had 4 does run by at light speed the last morning we hunted. And I knew what was coming next. About 5 minutes later, a dog came running by that had been chasing him. So I've still got some hunts left. I'm going to be hunting around Christmas time. My brother-in-law's got some private land I'm going to get on. And who knows? I keep putting in for these draws, and one of these times maybe I'm going to pull something. So I still got hopes for putting some meat in the freezer. That's my goal for the rest of the season. I need some venison. And we'll see for next year. I'm going to try to make some changes next year. We talked about moving to Georgia, or, I'm going to, get back at it with these draw hunts and hopefully pull some good stuff next year. So always looking at the positive, but I really would love to get some meat in the freezer. It's really a good thing that y'all aren't listening to this podcast to hear about my successes, because we probably wouldn't have a whole lot to talk about. Other than that, getting back to business stuff, I'm sold out of those vacuum sealer bags. So I really want to thank everybody that got online and got those. So those are going to be gone for good. But with the hunting gear deals side of things, Black Friday was a huge success. Tons of traffic, tons of sales. We were probably responsible for about $100,000 in sales, which to me means we probably help people save, $20,000, $25,000. So I'm really excited about how that went. Thank you for using the site. Also want to specifically thank the people that shared it on either social media or on some forums. I can tell you, I'm not members of the forum, so I don't know who it is, unfortunately, but thank you to whoever posted on Alabama deer. There was a Tennessee deer hunters forum that was shared on, Texas bow hunters, I think, but those are 3 main sites, and I can see where traffic comes from. And those were able to drive quite a bit of traffic. So those people that did that, yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. And I really appreciate any time you can, put your reputation on the line, recommending the site, and hopefully we make it worth your while. So that was a great success. We still have tons of really good deals going on up through Christmas. So if you haven't finished your shopping yet, and then in January, of course, we're going to have the clearance sales of the seasons being over. So make sure you're signed up to our email list. I know most of you probably are. I see tons of traffic from the South, and I really appreciate it. I am going to be going to the ATA show. I'd love to hear from y'all what kind of content you'd like me to do. I'm thinking about starting to do some more video content. Obviously not going to be videoing my hunts because that'd be pretty boring, but as far as gear goes, so if there's some stuff specifically you'd like to see, that kind of content, whether it's reviews or just open box type things, or just my experience with different stuff or what's new, that kind of stuff, let me know what you want to see, because I definitely want to be filling that niche right there. Anyway, I'd love to hear how your seasons are going. Keep sending me pictures. I really appreciate the people that have reached out and just talked about the latest episode or whatever. Like I talked before, right now is really tough with the podcast to make it a priority, because starting your own business is tough. It takes a while to start putting money in the bank. Anybody that's done it probably can relate real well. But no regrets doing it. I'd encourage anybody that's thinking about doing it. I'm living the dream, working from home on my own, doing my thing. It's pretty cool. So I know it's going to work out, but it's taken a while to do it. Let's get into this interview. That's enough of me talking. This is really good with David Tom starting out some great stuff. Okay, so next I want to talk about your Rut Tactics, but before we do that, I want to sidetrack a little bit here. And Dave, I'm saying this to both of you guys. I want to get Dave your opinion first, and then we'll circle back to you, John. So when you talk about the early season stuff and you're scouting cornfields and that kind of stuff, in my areas, that's not really an option. But that doesn't mean everything you say doesn't hold the same weight. It's just a different habitat. So when I hear John, talking about maybe scouting the edge of a cornfield first, I guess what I think of first in my area, maybe that would be equivalent to, say, like a cutover, where you have some really thick cover that's probably got food in it, and then around the outside of it, there'll be like a fire lane or some kind of road or something that goes around the outside, and then that might lead into maybe some more mature timber, oaks or something like that. So, Dave, I'm curious, like when you hear John mentioning that, and I know you're hunting in Texas a lot of the time, how do you apply that to your area?
Well, to me, early season is all about food. A buck's getting ready for wintertime and also the breeding season. So it's all about what is the best, most available food source that's going to help him put on weight. Obviously, when oaks are dropping, that's a primary draw, but that's a very narrow window. And a lot of places I hunt don't even have oaks, so it's natural browse. And that can vary. Like in Texas, with our heat and stuff down here, one of the things I look for is good shaded areas. Not only so the bucks can escape the heat, but also that's where the browse is more lush. It's got higher water content. It's just more nutritious. So, y'all were talking about how you do in-season scouting. I kind of agree with John on, walking the perimeters and stuff. But one of the things that I do in a lot of areas, especially in the South, where we got abundant bedding, is I walk waterways. I either walk them or float them in my kayaks or whatever, and I look for trail crossings and stuff, or, river crossings or crossings across creeks. That's where I'll start my initial scouting. And then I'll walk those crossings in a little ways and look for the sign, that you would find on the edges around crop fields and stuff. So, boy, like I said, ag country, it's kind of easy because for a fact where the predominant nutritious food sources are. When you're out in areas with natural browse, and I'm not talking about mass trees like apples or nuts or anything like that, but just the natural browse, which is probably 80% of a whitetail's diet anyway. Each terrain I hunt is so different. Another great tool that is power lines, railroad tracks, following those edges, staying out of the bedding, because a lot of the areas I hunt, we have an abundance of bedding. trying to focus in on where big bucks bed is really, really difficult when they can bed anywhere in hundreds and hundreds of acres. And so you can get busted quite easily. As John pointed out, you know, an intrusion into these areas, the bucks notice it. So to me, finding those corridors, whether it's a creek, a river, a gas pipeline, a power line, or something that you can walk, knowing the deer aren't going to bed right on that, is a good starting point. And then I look for those crossing trails or whatever that come across those, and then I'll follow those back in until I see the sign or I don't see the sign that I'm looking for. It's kind of like walking the edge of a swamp, you know, that a lot of times the deer are bedded right on the edge of the swamp, so you can get busted. But there's corridors where you know it's safe to walk, and you start picking up the sign there. And it's really, it comes from experience, knowing, well, you know what? I got busted. What's tonight? Tonight's Monday night. It was last night. I got busted trying to push in a little bit too far. You know, it happens. It's something that you got to kind of risk, in my opinion, when the deer can bed in a, you know, they're not suffering from bedding areas.
Right.
That's one thing I love about ag country is it's pretty easy, even from aerial photographs, to kind of make some good educated guesses on where the bedding areas are going to be. When you're looking at land that's 80% timber or brush and timber, it's a lot more complicated. Deer have three basic needs. They need cover or security, they need food, and they need water. And then the fourth factor that comes into play is the whole sex or the rut portion. Those things don't change from area to area to area. Now, what does come into play is your buck to doe ratio and your mature buck, your age structure, as I like to call it, of the herd comes into play. Because John is absolutely right. One of the worst rut hunts you can ever go on is in a state that has very few mature bucks and a lot of does. If that doe to buck ratio is out of whack, those bucks are going to find a doe within an hour or two, and they're going to stay with that doe. When they're done with that one, they're on to the next doe. There's an abundance of does, so they just don't have to, you know, do the rutting like you'll see in, Kansas or Iowa or even Ohio to some degree. You get that classic rutting activity. Well, that don't happen in every state like that.
Yep.
But for early season, it's all about what that buck's putting in his belly.
Dave was spot on. Early season is all about food, and what I see a lot of people. Well, let me back up a minute. You know, corn in the north is very similar to, let's say, a 5 or 6 year old cutover in the south. You know, cutovers have saplings, and deer eat on saplings, and they bed in it, and it's a food source. Mm-hmm. Corn is the same way. It's not only a bedding area, it's also a food source. So when you're scouting the edges of, you know, perimeters of cornfields or cutovers, it's kind of the similar thing, like you were saying. But everything early season revolves around food. And wherever there's going to be a lot of doe activity eating, there's going to be buck sign there. Because even during the early season in Michigan, that's, you know, early October, you know, bucks are still, their testosterone's rising. They've been out of velvet for 3 or 4 weeks. They're sparring for dominance and pecking order. So they're still thinking about does, even though their testosterone's not up to the heights that they're moving a lot during daylight hours yet. So one thing a lot of people make a mistake is when they, you know, food sources are great places to hunt the first few days of season in a pressured area, and then they need to be left alone. Because if they're going to continue dropping or offering food, and it's a small destination location, and you hunt that once the majority of the mature buck activity is turned nocturnal because of hunting pressure or preseason scouting pressure, what you're doing is you're altering the doe activity. And all buck activity during the rut phases revolves around doe activity. So as soon as you start over hunting these places, once the mature bucks are nocturnal, you're altering doe activity. And then obviously if the does are avoiding that food source during daylight hours, the bucks are going to avoid it when they start pursuing the does. They're going to avoid it during daylight hours. And another thing David said that was so true, and I mentioned it on the podcast with Hunting Public the other night, is when you go to states like Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, even when I was there's so many mature bucks vying for breeding rights because there's as many mature bucks as there are mature does. At least that's what I've always seen out there. I'll see 12 to 18 Pope and Young bucks in a week. I won't see 18 Pope and Young bucks in Michigan in 5 years of hunting all season. So because there's so many mature bucks out there, they have to move around a lot because the breeding rights is really competitive. So calling works, decoys work, rattling works, everything works, scents work, because there's just so many big bucks, and they're all fighting. You go out there, half of the bucks by mid-November have broken antlers because they fight so much for breeding rights. But then I guess I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
But David was spot on everything he said. Well, one other thing is a lot of times when you go down rivers, like in a canoe or a kayak or whatever, or walking down its edge during postseason, rivers have funnels. And a lot of people don't realize this. Rivers, when they have bends, the holes are deeper. Wherever it bends, there's a deep hole on the opposite side. And when you get straightaways in rivers, and it depends on the river, some rivers are, way too deep and it doesn't matter. But a lot of the rivers up in Michigan are relatively shallow. So when you find a flat area, that's going to be a place where the water is going to be shallower all the way across. And it's almost like a funnel, a river funnel. Or if you find an area where you got a river and it's got real high banks and they're steep, you follow that river until those banks go down lower, and you get a low spot where it's pretty level to the river and across into the timber a little bit. That's going to be just a natural funnel pinch point where deer are going to cross, as opposed to going down the steep bluffs of the river where they bend and things like that.
This might be just me whining for a minute, or maybe you guys have some crazy idea that I haven't thought of yet, but actually, this area I'm going to hunt has got a creek in it that I'm focusing a lot of my attention towards because it's just a different terrain feature. And last time I was up there a few weeks ago, I was really trying to find where they are crossing this creek because that I have pictures of deer on both sides of it. But when I get close to this creek, it's so thick and nasty for about 50 yards on both sides of it. I can't figure out where they're crossing. It's obviously they are somewhere. Maybe it's on, where the roads go through on the edges. But it's driving me nuts. Because I don't know what side the deer's going to be on, but I know if I can find that place where he crosses, it'd be a great place to ambush him.
How deep is the river or creek?
I would say it varies between 4 and 4 and 8 feet probably. It's not real wide. It's probably only 10 to 15 yards wide, but the banks on it are very steep. What happens is it's a very low-lying area, so when it's drier like it is right now, there's very steep banks that are probably 8 feet tall. But when there's a lot of rain, the whole thing overflows and it's it's completely full. And that might last
Mike,
2 days.
I'd like to throw something at you, Mike, and John, you can correct me if you see otherwise. When I find a thick creek or river like that, I tend to find the bucks will cross that river in a place where they got more visual. So this is one of those contrary places. I know John don't like hunting open hardwoods and stuff, but in a thick creek bottom, anytime a mature buck enters into a funnel, they tend to get a little bit nervous. I think they realize that, it's kind of a congested, dangerous place. I think a lot of predators hang out in funnels also.
Yeah.
So to me, when I have a thick creek area that I'm struggling finding where that buck is, the first place I'll make the assumption is I look for a place that's a little bit more open where that buck will have a good visual as well as a scent advantage. So, you can chime in there if you've seen something similar to that.
Well, I would agree with that. They like to have a visual, but they always like to be real close to exit security cover, obviously. And they always tend to cross river. I think what I would do if that was a spot where I was going to hunt it for a lot of years, I would probably go down that river in a kayak or a canoe in the spring, or is there too much deadfall land across it to do that?
There is. Maybe when the water's real low, maybe I could walk most of it and then climb up on the banks and the real deep parts. I mean, you're right, though. That's probably what I need to do is I think it will be obvious because most of it can deer cross it. Yes. But it's not one of there's got to be a place. We all know they're lazy or they want the path of least resistance. So that exists. I just haven't found it yet. It's just frustrating.
Yeah, I would suggest in the spring, walking its edge or whatever you can do. And I think the runways would be very, very obvious.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it's 50 yards deep to get, brush to get to the river from the outside edge,
yeah.
In that 50 yards, the runways that are heavy crossing the river may disperse and spider out before they're leaving the heavy brush. So at the river, you're going to find the exact pinpoint of where they're.
And there's bears in this area too, and I'm sure the bears they probably all use the similar areas that are more convenient. Now, there's a road within half a mile of each side, so that it has kind of occurred to me maybe they just don't go there in daylight, but they cross in the middle of the night. So I don't know.
Oh, they're crossing the river other than at the road. I guarantee you that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they can swim across a river with no big yank. That's not a big deal to a deer.
Yeah.
And they will have crossing zones.
Another thing I would tell you to do, Mike, is typically in those environments, bucks are going to have a parallel trail to the river.
Yes.
And I would walk that, and like John said, you're going to see the major runways going across that. Another thing to focus in, I'm sure you've heard of oxbows and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. But go ahead, explain, because some people wouldn't have.
Well, an oxbow is like a horseshoe bend in a river, and typically when the wind's blowing into the oxbow towards the river, that's when deer are going to bed there. They like the wind coming down into the oxbow on the river. Now, one thing I have learned about big bucks during the rut, or really the last week of October and early November when they're cruising, there will almost always be a faint trail cutting across that oxbow. And the reason why the bucks are doing that is they can use the scent to alert them for danger, but they're crossing all those doe trails going into the oxbow for bedding, looking for hot does. So one of my favorite setups where you can really manipulate the wind is to get on the mouth of the oxbow and look for that faint trail, that cruising trail, as I'll call it. And usually every time those cruising trails cross a major doe trail, you're going to find either a scrape or rubs or something at that location. Those can be dynamite setups.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
I don't know if I'm explaining that.
I definitely get it. Yeah. It doesn't apply to this particular situation, but I'm sure it applies to a lot of the listeners. So, obviously the more we can hit on different stuff, the better. Okay. So, let's get into a little bit more rut stuff like we've been talking about. John, I want to have you just touch on your scent control. You've mentioned it a couple times, and we did a whole podcast series on it a while back, but we have a lot of new listeners since then. So can you just kind of give us a quick rundown of what that scent regimen entails? And you mentioned when we talked before that it may be tough to even do some of what you do in the South when it's real hot like it is, but I do think 99% is better than 10% or whatever the numbers might be. So we can do it the best to our ability of what you do.
Well, to give you an example of the hot, because it was 85 degrees and really muggy opening day, the only time I've sat this year, and what I did is I put on a ScentLock light base layer, and I wore it in with a pair of ScentLock long john bottoms. And then when I got to the tree, I carried a Savannah jacket inside plus a T-shirt in my backpack. And when I got to the tree, by the time I got up the tree, put the steps on and everything, I was drenched.
Yeah.
I was literally drenched. And I took off my shirt, my ScentLock, just long sleeve tee, if you want to say, and I put it in a gallon Ziploc baggie, and then I had a bag of non-scent wipes in my backpack. I opened that up, and I used all of them, and I wiped my body down and my face, and I let myself cool off for a few minutes, and then I put on a new T-shirt, a dry T-shirt, and then I put on my scent-lock jacket and head cover. And it was just a year-and-a-half old 6-point, but he came in from downwind and never had a clue. So it can be done in hot weather. There's no question it's more difficult in hot weather because you got to do so much. But my scent regiment, I'm wearing a jacket, a pair of scent-lock pants. I wear the head cover with the drop-down face mask while I'm on stand. I don't wear that while I'm walking to my stand. I have a scent-lock backpack, and I'm suggesting if somebody is going to do activated carbon scent-lock suit and they use a regular backpack, they need to wash that backpack regularly in scent-free detergent and store it in an airtight container. So your scent-lock has to be taken care of properly. It has to be deabsorbed every 4 or 5 hunts in a dryer. You don't wash it. People that wash it are making a big, big mistake. So it's just deabsorbed in the dryer, and then it's got to be put into an airtight container. And you don't take it out of the container until you're actually going to wear it in the field. I always wear a scent-lock jacket and pant to my stand. That way when I brush against vegetation, I'm not worried about anything coming down that same runway and, smelling me. And then once I get up on stand, that's when I put on my head cover. And I always wear scent-lock gloves, too, because if I'm touching vegetation going in, I'm not leaving any odor and also going up the tree. And if anybody wants to know my scent procedure and all of the technology behind activated carbon, because it's not about scent-lock. Scent-lock just happens to own the patent on using activated carbon in hunting clothes. Nobody else can use it unless they pay scent-lock a royalty by law. So if anybody wants to shoot me an email and ask me for a scent control regiment inquiry, my email is deerjohn51@gmail.com. Again, deerjohn51@gmail.com. And I never pay attention to the wind. I may pay attention to the wind when I'm prepping a location. Like if I'm prepping something in the timber at a primary scrape area, if there's a tree on the southeast corner of that scrape area, 10 or 15 yards off the scrapes, I'll set that up because typically the prevailing winds are out of the northwest, and it's real common for a mature buck to not come into a scrape area during the daytime. They'll circle it and come on the downwind side and stay in the security cover and scent check it from downwind. Mm-hmm. So if I set up 15 yards southeast of the scrape area and the wind's out of the northwest and a deer comes in, up to 40 yards downwind of the scrapes to scent check it, I still have that shot. Whereas if I set up on the north side or northwest side and a deer was 30, 40 yards downwind of the scrapes, I would not be able to shoot at that deer. So that way, if it came into the scrapes or downwind of the scrapes, just to scent check it, I'll have that opportunity. And I've shot several bucks that way.
I know you've researched scent control stuff quite a bit. I'm curious. I don't think you use any ozone, but how does using like those ozone totes or that kind of stuff work with scent lock?
I've researched it. Back when ozone machines first came out, the first one was the Ozone 6 machine, and they sent me 3 of them to try, and they definitely got rid of the foreign odors. I used them on a stinky old pair of tennis shoes in a container.
Yeah.
And all the odor of the tennis shoes of my feet were gone, but it had a really strong ozone odor. Mm-hmm. So if you use an ozone machine to, basically break down all of the odor molecules in your clothing, whether it be scent lock or regular, polyester or cotton clothing, that's fine, but you've got to let it air out a little bit. You got to get rid of that ozone odor and let it turn into O2. But basically, if you're going to use an ozone machine over your head, like a lot of the guys do on TV that are paid $40,000 a year to do that, then, and also in the areas they hunt, they can get away with murder because the deer are kind of dumb and there's nobody hunts them but them. But the ozone thing over your head, that puts a downwind trail of ozone odor. And when you're hunting mature bucks in a hard-to-hunt area, If they smell anything that's foreign to that area, they're going to turn around and leave. So to me, an ozone over your head in a pressured area, if you're trying to kill 3.5-year-old and older bucks, is not cool. But as far as using ozone to break down the odor molecules to get rid of the human odor, that does work.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of set up our rut situation. So you're hunting downwind of a primary scrape, and you're downwind for bucks that may be scent checking it. And something that I've heard you talk about that's really intriguing to me, because you hunt such a high pressure state, is calling and rattling for bucks. So can you kind of give us your decision tree, or how you decide whether to do that or not, and how you do it?
Okay, when I'm out of state, I rattle almost every single sit. Okay, when I'm in Michigan, I actually I thought about rattling opening evening, to be perfectly honest with you, and I didn't, because it was kind of a little bit of open timber where I was at. It was a spot I freelanced to because it was public land. I never hunted that area before. And I just didn't think if I rattled, if a good buck came in, because the timber was kind of open, he'd only come in so far. And if he couldn't see a visual, he wouldn't commit to come in close enough for a shot. So in Michigan, the only times I rattle are when I'm in typically interiors of bedding areas. I don't think I've ever rattled in a buck in Michigan that made book that I've killed outside of a bedding area. And I've done it in a bedding area 4 times where I've rattled in a buck. Because in a bedding area, it's dense enough cover that a mature buck coming into a rattling, and I usually do a sparring sequence. I don't do anything aggressive because it spooks deer. But anyway, it's dense enough cover that a mature buck has to commit to coming in closer because he doesn't have a very long visual. Greg and Ernie, when they were up here, it's kind of funny. They were hunting this island. I sent them over to this island back where they had to cross, a couple hundred yards with hip boots. And they saw a buck coming out through some 4-foot tall ferns, probably 3.5 foot tall ferns. And Ernie thought he was going to rattle him in, and I think he did an aggressive sequence. And he said that buck turned around and ran like somebody shot at him with a rifle. He said, I've never seen a buck turn around so fast and leave in my life. And that was just a little buck.
Do you typically do any calling sequence with the rattling?
Typically not. No, because typically when you hear deer sparring, they're not grunting or doing anything else. They're just sparring. Okay. They're not making a lot.
Okay, how about buck grunts or doe bleats? Do you use either of those like blindly, or only to call for deer you see, or what? How do you use those?
I will use a doe bleat can blindly, cold calling. Grunt calls I typically only use when I visually see something. And again, I use everything more frequently when I'm out in Iowa or Kansas. It's rare that I have any hunt where I'm not using some form of a call or a decoy or something, because out there you just get so many. I would bet 50% of the times I've rattled antlers, I've had a buck come in. It may be on a 4-point or a 6-point, but I've had big ones come in too. You just get a lot of responses out there because the rut is so competitive. And decoys work great out there too. Decoys I don't use in Michigan anymore.
That's probably a good way to get shot. Well, I guess maybe not so much in archery season, but I know here in Florida we have a long good season. I'd be afraid of getting shot a lot of times using a decoy.
I would agree. One time I rattled these 2 bucks in. I saw these 2 deer just walking through the woods, going through a bedding area, going deeper in, and I knew they weren't coming close to me, and I couldn't tell what they were. It was early season. I think it was October 2nd. And so I said, what the hell? I'll do a sparring sequence. I did a sparring sequence, and all I can see is their legs underneath the trees. And they turned and they started coming towards me, and they got about 40 yards from me, and there was some oaks there, and they started eating acorns. And now I can see that they're both bucks. One was an 8-point, one was a 10-point. And they ate acorns for a few minutes, and now they're visually within, they could see me up in the tree if they looked up in the tree. They couldn't see the ground because there was a lot of brush between us. But they lost interest and they started moving back away towards deeper into the bedding area. So I carry an inhale and an exhale grunt call with me. So I took out the inhale grunt call because it's a lot softer, and I turned around the other direction to make it sound farther away, and I just did a real light grunt, and both of those bucks turned and came right in at 12 yards, and I shot the 10 point. So that was a hunt where I rattled and used the grunt call, because if I would have rattled, rattling has a sequence to it, and they would have known it was from up in the tree, obviously, because they were so close.
Yeah.
So I had to do a grunt.